G'day everyone, I'm gonna be honest, this meme and this story have been done to literal death at this point. Everyone involved with this story is dead. The horse that is the meme is so dead that even the guy whipping the horse has been dead for over a decade. So why? Why on God's green earth am I making a video about the bloody Emu War in 2025 when it's been so thoroughly covered by pretty much every history channel on YouTube? Well, there are two reasons. One, April is home to both April Fool's Day and of course Australia's national military holiday ANZAC Day, which is today, so it seemed appropriate. And people have been requesting that I make this video since I started getting popularity almost 4 years ago. And two, it's about bloody time an Australian actually tells this story the way it's meant to be bloody told. Because for Christ's sake, every single channel covering it has been American. Extra History, Oversimplified, Salmonella, even Fat Electrician has had a crack at it. And funnily enough, he is the only one to actually tell the full story. And even then, it was like a 5-minute short. Worse still. Much worse still. The only other major video I've found on it that was at a respectable length, not made by an American, was made by a British YouTuber who obviously either offshores his editing or doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Because apart from all the other massively inaccurate edits throughout the video, the biggest insult is when he talks about Australians returning from World War I, only to show US Navy TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from World War II, complete with Americans from World War II, with their M1 Garands, their M1 helmets, with their M1 bayonets, God fuck! And thus, I have decided to correct this injustice, once and for all, and tell the full history of the Emu Wars. Yes, wars. There were more than one. And for the record, it wasn't just Australia fighting birds either. Oh, no. We're going to get to that as well. Someone else lost a war to birds, and it was even dumber than ours. That's right, it's not just emus. We are talking about the entire history of ornithological combat operations to set the record straight once and for all. We're covering the whole thing. You see by the length of this video, we're doing it all. And we'll get to it right after the sponsor. Hey guys, if you've been watching the news recently, you'll know that things in the world are pretty crazy right now, and I think we could all use an escape. And for those of you from around the world, let me ask you something. Despite our war with the birds and dangerous wildlife, have you ever considered coming down under? We're coming up to our winter season, and that's human weather for literally everyone else. Only a mild 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or what Europeans would call a heat wave. But as someone who used to work in telecommunications, I know from my first-hand experience of very, very angry phone calls that sorting out a SIM card or dealing with data roaming charges is an absolute nightmare. Which is where our sponsor for today, Saily, comes in. Saily is an eSIM service for people travelling around the world, and it is quite possibly the single most convenient product I have ever seen. That's not even a bit for the ad, by the way, like, seriously. As a guy who used to sell and provide tech support for mobile phones, this is amazing. This would have saved me so many headaches. No more waiting in line at the airport for a country-specific SIM card, no more data roaming charges, simply download the app, select a plan, chuck in your coupon code right here, which is of course promo code Animarchy, install the eSIM to your device, and away you go. They have regional plans, global plans, 24/7 customer support, and because it's made by the guys over at NordVPN, it comes with their trademark security features built into the app. It works across all the major operating systems, and if your phone isn't eSIM compatible, don't worry. If you make a mistake or your phone just doesn't work with an eSIM, they offer a full refund. So, if you want to come visit me in Australia, I highly recommend downloading Saily to get an exclusive 15% discount on the eSIM data plans. Just download the app and use code Animarchy at checkout. Honestly guys, I'm not even kidding. This app rules. It's so good. Anyway, thank you to the sponsor. Back to our hostile wildlife. In the annals of history, there has always been the concept of the legendary faraway land, the continent unknown, a paradise over the horizon beyond the reach of the common man. Only the bold and the brave could seek out its shores, and those intrepid explorers would found a new land, a land of prosperity, a prosperity won through the hard work and courage of its colonists, braving a wild frontier. And that new land was, of course, America. Except there were people already living there, so when the Europeans arrived, things got awkward rather quickly. There was murdering, slaving, intercolonial strife with other Europeans, intercontinental slaving, even bigger intercolonial strife, leading to an intercontinental war, which the colonies didn't want to pay for without being able to at least negotiate the terms for their payment plan. One thing leads to another, some tea gets thrown into a harbour, someone fires a very loud gun in which the shot is heard round the world, and now America was no longer Europe 2.0, it was now Freedom Land. At least if you were a white man who owned property. Anyway, this was a problem. The American colonies were something like a third of the British Empire's economy at the time, and while they could handle the majority of this loss by shifting around their priorities among their other colonial possessions, there was significant damage to two major sectors of the economy. First was the agricultural sector. Lots of fertile farmland and even more grazing pasture for livestock was now owned by an independent foreign power, a hostile one, which means we will now have to pay for their trade goods at market rate instead of inside our own little monopolized trade network. The other issue was the disruption to the labour market. Europe then, as now, was exceedingly crowded, and Britain, by nature of being a collection of islands at the central hub of an empire, currently undergoing the Industrial Revolution, meant they were undergoing a huge economic and demographic shift, while also being even more exceedingly crowded. And when you have a lot of unemployed, desperate people looking for work in cities after industrialization kills the rural economy, you get crime. Lots and lots of crime. So much crime that the British government ran out of places to put the criminals serving time in prison, eventually stuffing them into decommissioned Royal Navy ships offshore to let them starve to death. It was then they came up with a brilliant idea. Why don't we just deport them? However, we can't send them to other countries as they're citizens and they don't want them either. So we will call it transporting. We will send them to penal colonies in the Americas as a means of both punishing criminal offenders while simultaneously relieving the strain on prisons and the government spending to maintain them. This was a great plan, and it worked wonders. Right up until the point those criminals and their rich landlords decided that they should get to decide what to do with their tax money. Taxation with representation or something. Imagine that. Thus, Britain needed to find a place to rebuild their imperial breadbasket and to put all the people they didn't want. Luckily for them, though, back in the day a bunch of Dutch blokes had been sailing around their colonies in the South Pacific, in what we now know today as Indonesia, when they had bumped into a massive island no one had ever seen before. It went on for thousands of miles in every direction, and when they charted it, they realized it must be the legendary Terra Australis, the Great Southern Land, theorized to exist on the bottom of the globe to act as a counterweight to Europe, Asia, and the Americas, because that's how gravity works in the 1700s. They also discovered a small island off the southern coast of this vast continent, naming it Van Diemen's Land. It was a weird place filled with some very angry raccoons and a weird dog with stripes like a zebra on it. But the fact is, it was hot, full of bugs, the animals were bizarre, not to mention exceedingly dangerous, and it was 5,000 miles away from the nearest real civilization. So they made the sensible decision to simply scrawl New Holland on their map, because what else are Dutch explorers going to name something, pack up their stuff, and sail back to their comfy, temperate tulip swamp to smoke weed and admire their pretty windmills. After that, a century goes by. Then the French show up. They find the Great Barrier Reef and think, oh, they are onto a winner. Only to take one look at the mainland and go, fuck this, Pierre, this place is merde. Funnily enough, the place they'd found was Sydney Harbour, which proves that to this day, the real estate market in Sydney and those house prices are complete and utter bullshit. Therefore, it wasn't until 1769 when Captain James Cook rolled up in the Endeavour and surveyed the entire east coast that Europeans had the full picture. Yet once again, after landing in Botany Bay and encountering the climate, the wildlife, not to mention the indigenous Australians who, quite rightly mind you, attacked them as alien invaders, the British decided, to use our modern lexicon, yeah nah, fuck that. They planted the flag, played the song, called it New South Wales because of all the rocky cliffs, and then dipped back to England at full sail just like the French. For the next couple of decades, all Australia amounted to in the eyes of the world was a scientific curiosity. A hostile land filled with strange animals and vicious natives, too distant and too deadly to profitably colonise. They'd send explorers and scientists occasionally, but no one really considered settling there at scale until the economic reality of our autistic cousins founding Freedom Land had truly set in. And so, on the 26th of January 1788, the first fleet of 11 ships landed in Botany Bay, realised it wasn't suitable for a harbour, and sailed round the corner to Sydney Cove, establishing the colony of New South Wales. Australia was born. Which means, for those who are unaware, our national holiday is the American equivalent of Columbus Day. You can imagine how well that goes down with everybody. Speaking of which, remember the Indigenous Australians? It's time for this bunch of displaced criminals with guns and their British aristocrat overlords to give them smallpox and then hunt them for sport while taking their land. To all of you Americans in the audience wondering why Aussies and Yanks seem to share a lot of cultural traits, about now you should be starting to see why. Anyway, ain't nobody got time for a century of Australian colonial history, so it is time for a speed run. So, like always, hit the music! After setting up the first penal colonies to lay the groundwork for expansion, free settlers start arriving to this new land to escape the strife and poverty in Europe. They start settling across the entire continent, displacing the indigenous population while setting up autonomous colonies, which would later form the basis for our modern states. Farming agriculture is difficult as the land is dry and inhospitable, but the wide open plains and outback scrub are excellent for livestock. This agricultural community develops for a while, and then gold gets discovered and the population explodes. This new wealth, however, makes the local colonial governments extremely corrupt, to the point that they start levying extortionate taxes enforced by transported criminals acting as the police. That's right, our colonial government thought it was a good idea to make the criminals the police. And given that a lot of the immigrants are from occupied peoples like Ireland, China, and even escaped African-American slaves, they'd had enough of the British giving them shit. So we rise up in armed revolt at the Eureka Stockade, declaring independence from the corrupt royal administration until the British Army pulls a Bunker Hill 2 electric boogaloo and crushes the rebels, to the outrage of the entire country. The only reason we avoid our own revolution is that the British remember what happened last time and backed down when we said we wanted representation. Thus, with America 2.0 successfully averted, to support the new gold rush and the huge population, we need more food and stuff, so the agricultural and natural resource sector of the economy expands to meet demand, resulting in an era of prosperity known as the Great Boom, until eventually we become self-sufficient to the point where we want to become an autonomous dominion of colonial states and an independent nation. Therefore, on January 1st, 1901, we federate our colonies into our states and territories, forming a united and independent Commonwealth, thereby making the nation of Australia an actual, certified thing. Alright, here we are. We are now an independent country taking our first steps into the new age. The gold rush is over, and we had a minor rough patch when the bubble it caused crashed the market, but by now we've used the wealth and population generated in that period to build a thriving export economy. The colonial exploration and exploitation of the continent has revealed several regions excellent for crop cultivation and farming. My own city, Adelaide, for example, is famous for its vineyards. All of them run by German Lutherans for some reason. It was religious persecution in Germany. Again, it's always religious persecution in Germany. Why are the worst things in human history always the result of religious persecution in Germany? Why are they like this? While Western Australia had found a wide expanse of fertile lowlands outside their capital city of Perth, a region they called the Wheat Belt, where they could plant a lot of seed crops. But the real gold mine, after our actual ones ran out, was livestock. Australia is big. Like, really big. Like, mainland USA big. It's also flat. And dry. It would be great land for cattle and sheep if it wasn't for that last part. The problem there isn't enough natural foliage because of it. It's mostly scrub. And to graze livestock, you need grasslands. So what if, and hear me out, we brought in African grasses like kikuyu that grow really well in dry conditions so we can feed the animals. It's a brilliant idea. This will give us a massive surge in easily accessible foliage to eat, and it spreads itself. It throws seeds everywhere, and it will give us the boost that we need. Furthermore, the fertilizer made naturally by that livestock will help boost our growing agricultural sector in the southwest. The crop yields we get will be huge. we could base our entire economy on wool and food exports, and if we need to do a little terraforming to make that happen, I mean, so be it. I'm sure, like, we've planned this out, we've thought ahead. I'm sure this won't have adverse consequences later on.
And the business, we call this foreshadowing.
As a result of all these efforts, Australia becomes an agricultural powerhouse. So much so that we crashed the international wool market for a while, and that may have left a third of Australians unemployed for a year. But you can't build a nation properly without playing the game of capitalism. At the same time we were doing that, we were also passing legislation in our new capital city of Canberra, and one of those pieces of legislation was an immigration bill called the White Australia Policy. I'm sure it needs a great deal of imagination to understand what that means. We also reintroduced slavery, actually, though we didn't call it slavery. It was called blackbirding. And again, you can probably guess why. Though our government and their corporate backers strenuously asserted that legally it wasn't slavery, because they were paying their workers. It's just that their wages ever so happened to match up exactly with the costs of their room and board. Incredible. The coincidence. Like, what is the likelihood of that? It's remarkably convenient, don't you think? And we did all of this while encouraging immigration from Britain. In fact, throughout Australia's entire history, there were multiple immigration schemes encouraging British migrants, including paying them. And these added incentives, along with a natural and perfectly human desire to get the hell out of Great Britain, caused a second population explosion while reinforcing our political ties with the Empire. And this was almost certainly a calculated move by the British and Australian governments to prevent the angry independent colonists that had pioneered the nation's early days and pushed for independence from developing a craving for hamburgers. With this demographic shift and large infusion of British patriotism, we were once again a proud part of the Commonwealth, a frontier outpost of His Majesty's glorious empire. Something that turned out to be rather convenient, because at that exact moment, some bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry, and while at breakfast with his mate Germany, he decided to go and order Belgian waffles, which means we now have to go to this place called Gallipoli to shoot a large turkey in order to prove that we are far better than they are at shooting birds. Oh, fuck me. Anyway, after that, a bunch of shenanigans happened. We were the only army to actually achieve our objectives during the First Battle of the Somme. Then we kill that turkey with the last great cavalry charge in history. Then we steal a tank, kill the Red Baron, and then we save the entire British army from destruction by stopping the Kaiserschlacht offensive in 1918, single-handedly saving the city of Amiens from capture, which bought just enough time for the Americans to show up and take all the credit. Then, after a couple of 100,000 more human beings lay down their lives for the stupidity of Europe's royal families, the war ends. And now, we have a problem. 30% of Australian men signed up for World War I, and 62,000 of them died, which at the time was 1.2% of the entire national population. Thousands more were horribly wounded, or have been hospitalized from everything from Spanish flu to crippling psychiatric issues from PTSD, or shell shock, as it was called at the time. And just to show you how little things have changed, employability and housing for these veterans was a critical concern for the government that they couldn't fix no matter how hard they tried. However, the current economic situation allowed them to fall back onto an old and reliable solution. When you completed a full career tour as a soldier in the Roman Legion, you would be granted a plot of land to farm for your retirement. Thus, the Australian soldiery would receive priority for housing and employment, with subsidies from the state to encourage migration to key sectors of the economy: manufacturing, resource extraction, and of course, agriculture. Many of the men who had already been in this business had already joined the Light Horse and Dragoons due to their ability to ride, so they simply returned to their living as stockmen, or cowboys for you Americans. But in Western Australia, the government was eagerly offering grants and titles for cheap land in the less fertile parts of the wheat belt outside Perth. Due to its lower quality land and remote location, this was an area of the economy that still needed exploitation, and with no work, no prospects, and what appeared to be a guaranteed living on offer, over 5,000 veterans took up the offer and began setting up homesteads, augmented by another wave of British migrants fleeing the post-war recession and rationing in the UK. They were slow to start at first. The promised subsidies and support from the government was, surprise surprise, slow to arrive, causing many of the new tenants to just give up and head back to Perth in frustration. Many of them had never done any farming before coming, which had the predictable result of crop failures and failing to turn a profit. The veterans, though, they stuck with it, and eventually they started making some serious progress. By 1929, there were dozens of very successful farming towns with thousands of homesteads growing bumper harvests. But that year, 1929, should sound very familiar to you. Once again, here comes the big sad to ruin everything. Like everywhere else around the world, the Australian economy imploded. And when I say imploded, I mean utter annihilation. We owed a lot of money to the United States, who, to cover their losses, shifted to an ultra-protectionist platform and called in all of their foreign debt. And if you want to help me pay off my debts, you can always like and subscribe, and click the notification bell. It would really help me out. Or you could subscribe to my Patreon and give me money. Or, failing that, if you want to actually get something tangible for your money, you can use my GamerSupps promo code, JDAMN, spelt JDAMN. Seriously guys, every like really does go a long way to helping me in the algorithm. Anyway, back to it. Every country around the world shifted hard into isolationist policies in the vain hope to preserve their domestic job markets, only to realise that due to the rapid onset of globalisation, these policies, and especially the tariffs, actually hurt the economy more. And guess what this perfect storm would do to an export economy like Australia? The entire market went into freefall. Unemployment shot back up to 30%, and the agricultural sector started to hemorrhage people back into the cities out of desperation. In response to this, the Australian government under Prime Minister James Scullin decided that the best course of action was a stimulus package to purchase agricultural produce at a competitive market rate to keep the farmers in a job while compensating for the loss of market access with increased production, in the hope that sales quantity could offset the hit to the economy. And I think you can see the flaw in this plan. Wheat prices crashed, with a massive surplus of production, while the government, in a shock to everyone yet again, failed to deliver on their subsidies. They had promised over 2 million great Australian pounds in support for the farmers, but delivered, as they say in the business, somewhere between jack and shit. And this caused the farmers to strike, refusing to deliver the grain. And now, it was 1932. Wheat prices were in the toilet, the Great Depression still ravaging the global economy, and the government was unpopular. And when I say unpopular, I am talking by Australian standards, which, for context, is even worse than America. In Australia, being a politician is consistently ranked as the single most hated occupation, above real estate agents and telemarketers. The local criminal drug dealers are more popular than our politicians, and that isn't even a joke. So when I say the government was in meltdown, I mean it. To the point that Western Australia, home of the wheat belt, remember, had become the largest agricultural producer in the country and was therefore starting to advocate for secession and potential civil war over this issue. It seriously looked as though things just really couldn't possibly get any worse. Until suddenly, them. 6 feet tall, over 100 pounds in weight, razor-sharp claws, and a top speed of over 30 miles an hour. The emu is the second largest terrestrial bird on planet Earth after the ostrich, and is quite literally a living dinosaur. Emus are direct descendants of various dinosaur species that evolved during the Cretaceous period. The only thing more dangerous than a territorial emu is its cousin, the cassowary, who is again a distant living relative of the now infamous raptor family of dinosaurs, complete with the disemboweling claw. Cassowaries have a history of killing people in Australia, and they even have a confirmed victim in Florida. They killed a Florida man. Thank God the emu never inherited that little trait, otherwise we'd be in real trouble. Nevertheless, they are big, fast, strong, and if provoked, can be extremely dangerous. Though most of the time their focus is on eating and not fighting. But as it turned out, this was actually an even bigger problem. So remember how I mentioned we introduced a bunch of hardy African grass to feed our livestock? Well, turns out that these grass species do really well when there are no native species that can compete with them for growth rate. Combine that with a lot of cows and sheep propagating the seeds everywhere, and you have a ferocious invasive plant species. And this new abundance of plant life caused a corresponding population explosion among Australia's herbivore species, especially our two national animals, the kangaroo and the emu. But that shouldn't be a problem, because we have two very lethal natural predators down under that should be able to handle it. The dingo and the thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger. Except they saw the choice between giant, muscular, 30-mile-an-hour emus and kangaroos, or very slow and rather stupid cows and sheep. They obviously made the logical decision, which predictably resulted in,
"Come here, you little furry fuckers, and try and eat this, baby!"
yeah. To protect our livestock, we hunted the dingo into endangerment while rendering the thylacine actually extinct. This is the last surviving video footage of what was at the time the only Tasmanian tiger in captivity. As you can imagine, removing the only natural predators for an animal while tripling their food supply results in more of said animal. Tie that in with severe drought conditions during the migration season, forcing them further towards the coastline, and you now have between 20 to 30,000 6-foot muscle-bound birds moving in mobs towards your newly settled farmers in the wheat belt. Oh, by the way, a group of emus is actually called a mob. They are indeed gangsters when they want to be, as you'll soon discover. Anyway, this horde of avian invaders descended upon the helpless farming communities of Western Australia in force, laying waste to wheat fields and everything in them. The rabbit-proof fencing put in place to keep yet another introduced ecological disaster from ruining their crops is naught but a flimsy annoyance, which these emus ruthlessly knock down in their quest for sustenance. This in turn results in a second echelon of very hungry bunny rabbits sweeping the rear areas behind the front lines for any surviving wheat chaff that could perhaps offer resistance to this overwhelming ornithological offensive. And after this two-pronged attack goes through a farm, both the crops and the soil are utterly obliterated, ruining the livelihoods of hundreds of farmers in their wake. Something had to be done, and it went all the way to the highest authority.
That's a bloody outrage, it is! I want to take this all the way to the Prime Minister! Hey! Mr. Prime Minister!
A solution was immediately called for. One Senator Brown stood up in the House and demanded action, immediate action, after informing everyone of the following.
Anyone who's been to the districts where the emus are plentiful knows that the birds actually roll down the crops. They act in a crop much as the barnyard fowls act in a fowl yard. The crops in this part of Western Australia were just about ripe. It was explained to me that the use of rifles for the extinction of the birds was quite ineffective, because only one or two of the birds could be shot before the remainder scattered far and wide. Ordinary fences such as keep dingoes and kangaroos offer no obstacle to the emu, for the birds take them in their stride, or knock them down, and thus let rabbits into the crops.
Given what we know now, if only Senator Brown had bothered to brief the men sent to handle the situation, a lot of headaches could have been avoided. After a month of brutality at the claws of these beaked bandits, the tactical situation had degraded to a point of desperation. In the face of such overwhelming numbers, rifle fire was proving to be ineffective. Not only did the aforementioned scattering after the first shot cause problems, very often due to the thick coat of feathers, leathery skin, a very muscular frame, and the fact that the vital organs of an emu are near impossible to hit reliably, especially the head for obvious reasons, a deputation of veteran farmers appealed to the then Defence Minister and Senator for Western Australia, the immaculately titled Right Honourable Sir George Pearce, Knight Commander of the Victorian Order. And these blokes asked for access to heavy machine guns, in order to purge these blight-bringing birds from the earth once and for all. Now, in my personal opinion, we should have just handed out the guns and ammunition to the farmers so they could form an anti-emu militia. But the Australian government then and now, as we know, hates fun. After talking it over with the Prime Minister, the new one, Prime Minister Lyons, Senator Pierce decided on a genius plan. Instead of helping the veterans solve their own problems in terrain they are familiar with using equipment they've been trained on, what if we send the army out there with the machine guns and wage war on the emus? If we solve this crisis using government assets, it will do wonders for our popularity, and maybe, just maybe, we can stop the Western Australians from seceding when they realise how much they need us. But we're going to need a plan. Alright, so what are we going to... I've got it! I know exactly what we'll do. What we'll do is we'll send a squad of machine gunners out there with a camera crew from Australian Movie Tone. We'll get them to film propaganda for us. We'll film the whole thing, showing us doing work on pest control and solving the emu problem, and that'll get our popularity polling back to where it should be. Fun fact for you in the audience, Australian Movie Tone is Australian Fox Movie Tone, which was then integrated into Fox Australia. Yes, the Australian government pulled a George W. Bush 80 years early and sent Fox News out with these guys to make propaganda for our glorious triumph over the emus. And thus, the Australian army mustered a mighty task force to defeat the feathered foe, calling on the very finest members of the service, the 7th Battery of His Majesty's Royal Australian Artillery. 3 men. Not 3,000, not 300, just 3 blokes. Mary, Macca, and J.O. Or, to use their government-issued slave names, Major Gwynedd Perves Wyn Aubrey Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Once again, the British colonial government sending expendable Welsh and Irishmen to do their dirty work. Even after independence and our own government, it still doesn't change. And as the month of October drew to a close, these mighty warriors of the land down under prepared to do battle against our primordial enemy, the wildlife. But of course, this is an army operation, so as they were deploying, the 6-month-long drought ended and rained out the operation for a solid 2 weeks. Because raining on soldiers builds character, and God loves the infantry. So now E-Day was set for November the 2nd, 1932. On that day, around the farming town of Campion, working with the local farmers' militia to establish a kill zone, the 3 Aussie diggers began herding the emus into one concentrated mass. Yet the enemy was not to be fooled. Dingoes also hunt in groups, and they recognized a pack hunt when they saw one. Sensing danger, the emus split up into small groups to break out of the trap. Realizing their quarry was attempting to escape, Macca and J.O. opened fire with their mighty secret weapon, the Birmingham Small Arms Lewis machine gun. The only problem was they had been forced to engage before they could establish their ambush position, and so they were firing well beyond their optimal effective range. Most of their rounds missed, and on the first burst, the birds began sprinting in all directions. Realizing they had to move fast, the Aussies themselves began to run to a better firing position, setting up the gun to engage the nearest fleeing mob of emus. And in a credit to their service and martial skill as well as their marksmanship, they managed to kill several of the birds as they fled. But it was far below their assigned quota of 100 emu hides to make hats for the light horse. They had to keep trying no matter what. So, pursuing a detached force of around 20 emus into a small clearing, the intrepid Antipodeans once again opened fire. This time at much closer range and with better results, killing around 12 emus before they could escape. At the end of the first day of combat, the score was around 17 dead birds for a whole day's work and several drums of ammunition. Yeah, nah, we're gonna have to do better than that. It was time to strategize. The emus are coming to the coast for the abundant food supply, we know that. Yet we also know they were searching for reliable access to water. Where is the local dam? Eureka! It was time for another trap. Laying in wait among the scrub around the water source, over 1,000 emus wandered aimlessly into their line of fire, stopping to hydrate before more gratuitous agricultural vandalism. It was perfect. They don't get better than this. Victory would be ours. Major Meredith took a deep breath and gave the order to fire. At that moment, both Lewis guns roared into life, spraying .303 rounds into the stampeding mass of a panicking enemy, only for both of the guns to immediately jam. After setting up a textbook ambush in a perfect firing position at point-blank range, targeting a concentrated mass of 1,000 enemy combatants rendered captive to a water source, they only killed 12 birds. And with the entire mob now panicked, by the time they cleared the weapon malfunction, every emu in the region had scattered to the wind. Even with the aid of the farmers, they swept the entire region and did not find a single target for the rest of the day. Further innovation would be required. The decisive tactical advantage of the emu is its speed. Every engagement is ended prematurely due to their ability to break contact and redeploy to a superior defensive position. If we want to defeat them, we will have to improve our tactical mobility. Hang on, what was that bloke's name? You know, in the newspapers, that American cavalry officer. Yeah, you know the guy who tried to take out Pancho Villa with a drive-by? What was his? Patton, that's the guy. He's been experimenting with rigging a machine gun to vehicles. Now what if, hear me out, we rig one of the guns to a farmer's truck and just chase him down? I mean, it worked for those Ukrainian anarchists and their horse buggies in their civil war. I mean, I don't know, how hard could it be?
Don't say that!
With some outback engineering and some true blue Aussie hard work, we now had our own national entry to the world-famous Reddit page, r/shittytechnicals. This would be the game-changing, war-winning weapon to cleanse our land of these Cretaceous creatures once and for all. The gunners mounted their tactically acquired vehicle and began their valiant pursuit of the enemy, only to find out that your average 1920s Holden truck has suspension stiffer than an F1 car and a top-speed cross-country 5 miles an hour slower than the emus. The moment the rumble of the engine disrupted their peaceful feeding, the emus began to run in every direction. And while the gunners could now keep pace with the enemy, now they couldn't hit them. Because without a gyroscopic stabilizer, the ride was so awful, aiming the gun was physically impossible, spraying rounds in every direction except at the target. And even if they could hit them, the emus would scatter so widely that the vehicle could only pursue one emu at a time, rendering the whole exercise entirely pointless. You can't sneak up on birds with a truck engine going, so you can't get into effective range to engage from a stationary firing position anyway. In fact, the only successful kill they got on an emu from the truck is apparently when they ran one over, which immediately caused them to swerve violently off course through a farmer's fence, causing even more serious damage thanks to the rabbit second echelon. That emu gave his life for the Emperor, and the news crew was filming it all. I wish they'd kept the footage, but the government almost definitely leaned on them to have it destroyed. Over the coming days, our brave heroes ventured forth into the farmlands between the towns of Campion and Walgulan on the hunt for more prey. But by now, the emus had gotten wise. Army observers noted that the various mobs in the area were now starting to put their alpha male on lookout duty, using his height and long neck to scan the surrounding area for potential threats. Every time Meredith and his men tried to get close enough to set up a kill zone, the emus made their escape. They had some successes, an odd kill here and there, but the rugged anatomy of the emu, the technical limitations of their equipment, and the lack of combat power prevented any form of decisive victory. By November 8th, 1932, questions were being asked in Parliament. Serious questions, damning questions even. And when the news of the latest failure reached Canberra, tensions boiled over. During question time that day, Harold Thornby MP stood up and made the following charge. Has the attention of the Prime Minister been drawn to the report published in the press today that emus are being hunted in Central Australia by machine guns mounted on lorries? If so, will he inform me who is responsible for this farce and who is footing the bill? And things only got worse when not only the press got more details on the story, but the Treasury started getting receipts. as Senator E.B. Johnston so eloquently put. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I put it to my right honourable colleague, the Treasurer. Is it a fact that on behalf of the Defence Department, the Kellerberrin branch of the Agricultural Bank of Western Australia lately sent an account for £24 to Mr. D.J. O'Leary of Walgoolan, Western Australia, for the payment of the full cost of the ammunition used by a section of the Defence Force from Melbourne who were detailed with machine guns to destroy emus in the Walgoolan district in 1932? Has the Minister for Defence or the Agricultural Bank received a letter from Mr. O'Leary stating that as Napoleon's ideas are now obsolete, the army engaged in the campaign did not march on its stomach, but in fact in Mr. O'Leary's motor car, the well-fed condition of the troops being responsible for the breakage of the chassis of that vehicle? Is it a fact, as stated by Mr. O'Leary, the £900 worth of wheat for which damages are claimed was not consumed by the troops, but was actually destroyed by the enemy during the delay in commencing operations, a delay occasioned by the necessary war conference between the bank and Sir George Pearce, Minister of Defence, to determine who should pay for the cost of the ammunition used in this campaign? And their concerns about cost were well placed. The army had been allocated 10,000 rounds of ammunition for this expedition, 2,500 of which had been fired, and all they had to show for it was roughly 250 dead emus. That's 10 rounds per kill if you're counting. And as mentioned before, even if they hit the target, unless it hit the heart or the head, chances are that the bird would not only escape, but survive its wounds. As Major Meredith himself says,
if we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus, who even dum-dum bullets could not stop.
Facing humiliation and political controversy for wasting taxpayers' money during the world's largest financial crisis, imagine that, the army was recalled to base in ignominious defeat, with Major Meredith citing in his report the expenditures of ammunition, the tactical challenges posed by the mission, and the casualties suffered, which included, and I quote, our dignity. Yet despite the farcical nature of this operation, the withdrawal of military support royally pissed off the farmers, because now the government was abandoning them again. Defence Minister Pearce had backed himself into a corner, and he really couldn't find his way out of it. And the moment the soldiers withdrew, the emus returned in force, reaving across the wheat fields of WA like one of the biblical plagues of old, freshly emboldened by their victory. With the crisis now escalating further, calls for secession were growing louder, and angry farmers who, despite their inability to kill the emus, were still very well armed and now even angrier at the government. The Premier, or Governor for you Americans, of Western Australia, Sir James Mitchell, loudly petitioned the Senate for a resumption of military aid to defeat the renewed avian onslaught, and upon receiving the reports from the front line, Defence Minister Pearce reluctantly agreed. Phone calls were made, documents were signed, and Meredith, having just gotten back from the field 4 days prior, was given a call and told that seeing as he was the only experienced machine gun battery commander in the entire state of WA, he was going back in. On November 13th, 1932, Mary led another team of valiant warriors against the scourge of our lands. This time he was going to be methodical. By now we had learned the ways of our feathered foes, and were ready to begin the struggle anew. There would be no grand ambushes, no innovative tactics, no clever strategies. It was back to good old-fashioned practical soldiering. With another 20,000 rounds of ammunition, their Lewis guns on their backs, the men of the 7th Battery Royal Australian Artillery Regiment marched into the fields outside Walgoolan and began methodically shooting emus. Short, sustained bursts into single birds at a time, ensuring the kill as they went. It wasn't the rapid, dashing triumph they had promised. This was now the final chapter of the Great War. Pure attrition tactics until the enemy is defeated. And amazingly, it started to work. Within the first 3 days, 50 emus were taken down, followed by another 30, until eventually they were averaging over 100 dead emus per week. However, by now, the politicians and the press had taken matters out of the farmers' and soldiers' hands. Despite the slow but steady success now being achieved by Meredith and his men, concerns about cost to the taxpayer and the absolute avalanche of mockery in the newspapers forced the government to order their withdrawal. In his after-action report, Major Meredith cited 986 emus confirmed KIA for an expenditure of 9,860 rounds, confirmed to be exactly 10 rounds per kill. He also estimated that at least another 2,000 most likely died of wounds inflicted during the various combat actions, but this is naturally hard to confirm. In terms of recognition for the bravery of Australia's fighting men in this heroic campaign against our mortal enemies, when discussions were brought up in Parliament of whether a medal should be struck to commemorate the men fighting this conflict, the Labour representative for Western Australia responded, and I quote, that if such a medal were to be issued, it should go to the emus who have won every round thus far. And so, after all of that effort, all that money, and all the carnage inflicted on the rapacious foe, Australia unconditionally surrendered the field to the emus, who continued to plunder the wheat belt for many years to come. And yet, like our future enemies in Vietnam and Afghanistan, we decided to play the long game to turn defeat into victory. You see, in the years that followed, the farmers continued requesting military assistance from the government, and each time they were turned down. Scars left by the initial intervention were too deep in the political landscape to consider it. In 1933, during a particularly rowdy session, Senator Dunn openly mocked the Senate leader over the campaign, and I quote, "In the days of old, when knights were bold, and warriors held their sway, when the right honourable gentleman puts on his tin armour, decorates his headpiece with a few emu feathers, taken from the birds which were bravely slaughtered in battle in Western Australia, and grasps with 2 hands his broadsword, he will overawe his opponents, and the supremacy of the Senate will be assured." Any attempt to resume aid to the farmers was overruled from on high as just another expense the country couldn't afford. Yet the emu plague continued, and calls grew louder. So loud they requested the Royal Australian Air Force to conduct combat air patrols over the wheat belt in order to strafe and actually bomb emu mobs. Alas, to no avail. So how did they actually resolve this crisis in the end? Well, the answer is unsurprising. Capitalism. First, the Australian government cut excess spending and reinvested the savings into infrastructure projects, among which was vastly improved fencing for rural properties. They also devalued the currency and changed the tariff policies, meaning people would now actually buy stuff from us. Incredible how that works, isn't it? This all resulted in the acquisition of much-needed capital. Capital that would be reinvested and paid back to the farmers as bounties. Yes, you heard correctly. After all of that nonsense, all of this running around the outback after birds we can't catch, how did we defeat the emus? We invested in infrastructure, built a better fence network, removed tariffs, improved our economy, and then provided the farmers with 500,000 rounds of .303 Lee-Enfield ammunition, while reinstituting the old pest control cash bounties from 1923, paying the farmers for every emu they shot. Sure enough, within 6 months, the farming communities of Western Australia claimed over 50,000 bounties. That's almost 2,000 emus a week. Turns out, if you give people the ability and the incentive to solve their own problems and let them do it, they could have fixed the entire issue within a year. Wild how that works now, isn't it? Almost as though that's what they asked for in the fucking first place. And thus, the Great Emu War was at an end. Until the next one in 1943. And the one in 1948. And the one in 1953, which was the last Great Emu War. Yeah, emus continued to be an ongoing problem for many years after that, but at least now we had the solution of just hand the farmers ammunition and pay them per kill. It would be amazing how many pest control initiatives could be solved if we did it that way. Hell, Florida's python problem could be gone in months if we just started handing out ammo to Florida men for free. It'd be easy. Nevertheless, to this very day, Australians around the world are mocked over this military failure, and rightfully so. Our numerous triumphs in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam are all largely forgotten, while the meme of flightless birds driving our army from the field continues to spread like a summer bushfire across the internet, being told and retold again and again by every history creator on every platform. At least now we have what is probably the single most comprehensive account, and it's told by actual Australians. Finally. Yet if you recall the start of this video, I mentioned that we are not the only country to lose a war against birds. Oh no. There is another. And they lost to a degree far, far worse. If you are a student of history, you may know already to which country I refer. But even if you aren't, by process of elimination, there really is only one country, unserious and frankly stupid enough, to ever suffer such a farcical failure. A country so mind-bogglingly idiotic in its bureaucratic disasters that it could only be that country. And yet, it's not the Soviet Union, but it is the Soviet Union's Chinese cousin. The year is 1958, and Chairman Mao was initiating his master plan to wrench Chinese society into the 20th century through sweeping reforms of the entire socio-economic structure of the nation. Known as the Great Leap Forward, Mao wanted to achieve the same, quote, success, end quote, that Stalin had achieved in the 1930s, only on an even larger scale. In order to industrialize, he ordered a tripling of the urban population. He wanted to bring everyone into the cities in order to massively increase productivity in important sectors of the economy, primarily steel production. This went to the extent that families were encouraged to smelt pig iron in their backyards. However, I'm sure you can understand that suddenly importing all your farmers into factory jobs means no one is farming. Those of you who've seen my Soviet aviation series, or basically anyone who's glanced at the history of Marxist-Leninist communist states, will know what's coming next. But don't worry. You see, Mao has a plan. A cunning plan. A new wave of agricultural reforms that will solve everything. And it's called Lysenkoism. Oh dear God, no. Okay, I'm not a biologist, so my understanding here is of the historical and societal consequences rather than the science itself. But I'll try. Essentially, the very basic concept is that Lysenko, the man responsible for this theory, posited that genetics and selective breeding were actually pseudoscientific, and that agriscience was actually a matter of subverting natural selection by controlling the environment. The idea being that you could train a crop into being a certain way, which would then ensure subsequent generations would build off that success. So if we artificially induce a crop to grow fast by planting it in hostile environments, and then control those environments, we can then breed stronger crops. To put this in an abstract example that's easier to understand, imagine a really skinny dude wants to get swole so he can get hella bitches. So he becomes a bodybuilder and starts calorie loading until he's buff as shit. His inherent genetics are still that of a really skinny man. But Lysenkoism argues that if he becomes a bodybuilder and gets shredded to all hell, when he has children, they will naturally be stronger and more buff. Therefore, you inherit the traits of what you are now, rather than that in your DNA. And speaking of that, genetics, DNA, hereditary breeding, genetic engineering, and lab-tested agriculture, all of it nonsense. In fact, these sciences were banned in communist countries as anti-Marxist bourgeois pseudoscience, with Lamarckism and its successor Lysenkoism taking their place. And it was this theory that the People's Republic of China adopted to resolve the impending agricultural crisis they were creating, which, as you can probably imagine, made it worse beyond anything previously recorded. They planted out of rotation, planted in soil completely unsuitable. They centralized all agricultural production under state control, and then essentially enslaved the farmers in state-run communes to work the fields. No private or even personal property. Freedom of movement was abolished, requiring passports to visit family in the next commune over, and a number of other ever-worsening restrictions. As a result, each commune was mandated to be self-sufficient, despite that being functionally impossible. It's literally impossible to make a small township in the middle of nowhere self-sufficient, meaning internal supply lines broke down, and thus, instead of rapidly increasing food production, the opposite occurred. The entire agricultural supply chain for China's population centers imploded. Food stocks rapidly began to deplete. The emergency reserves in the granaries were consumed much faster than they could be replenished. Famine was on the horizon. Something had to be done. A conference was called to discuss the crisis and potential solutions. But being a communist dictatorship, when the meetings were actually held, officials, fearing Mao's wrath and the Red Guards lynching them for counter-revolutionary thought, instead lied about the shortfalls in production, and instead claimed that the issue wasn't with the methods put forward by Lysenko and the chairman, rather that it was one of execution. It was a mistake, we needed to improve it. The environment was not being shaped correctly to achieve the results laid out in the 8-point agricultural constitution. They would need a transformation of nature, the cornerstone of which being a nationwide pest control campaign targeting the 4 great scourges of Chinese society that were limiting production. First was the mosquito, which spreads diseases that remove workers from the labor pool via sickness and death. Second were flies, for the exact same reason. The third enemy were the rodents, mice and rats, who infiltrated food storage facilities and consumed the harvests, while also being a vector of the bubonic plague via their fleas. But there was one pest, one enemy that would be targeted above all. They were to be the subject of total war. Not one of these animals could be allowed to live. The fourth target had its own dedicated campaign for elimination outright. That target were the sparrows. This led to the 4 Pests campaign being unofficially known among Chinese citizens as the Smash the Sparrows campaign, a commandment from the chairman to annihilate these claw-bearing class enemies. I'm not even memeing here, by the way. All birds were actually declared the capitalists of the animal kingdom, and the entire country was mobilized to carry out this war on the avian menace. In Australia, we went after the emus with 3 blokes, 2 machine guns, and a dream. Meanwhile, Communist China mobilized their entire population of 1 billion people. School children would be sent out after classes with BB guns and fly swatters. High schoolers went out with 22s and old Mosin Nagants. When going about their day, Chinese workers had a quota of flies and mosquitoes to kill. They had to get their daily sparrow while on lunch break or after hours. It was a full nationwide mobilization, complete with propaganda posters, high score tables, and rewards for the children who scored the most kills. It got so intense that at one stage, the Polish embassy in Beijing, which barred entry to non-state personnel so regular citizens couldn't get access to the building, ended up getting besieged by a crowd of Red Guards with drums, who kept banging away at their instruments to scare the sparrows out of the trees in their courtyard so they could be gunned down. This was actually common practice for Red Guards across the entire country. Eventually, so many sparrows were killed in this one engagement that the Polish embassy staff had to clear over 1,000 dead birds from their courtyard. They were literally shoveling corpses into the bin. And things only kept ramping up. The People's Daily newspaper loudly proclaimed that not a single warrior shall be withdrawn from this national battle. Children were taught how to climb trees to destroy the nests. Marksmanship classes were held, so even more sparrows could be shot. The Red Guards would host sparrow hunts, where they would march through the towns and villages waving flags, exterminating any unfortunate avian they found. As a Shanghai newspaper wrote on the initiation of hostilities, On the early morning of December 13th, 1958, the citywide battle to destroy the sparrows began. In large and small streets, red flags were waving. On the buildings and in the courtyards, open spaces, roads and rural farm fields, there were numerous scarecrows, sentries, elementary and middle school students, government office employees, factory workers, farmers, and members of the People's Liberation Army shouting their war cries. In the Jinsheng district, they produced more than 80,000 scarecrows and more than 100,000 colourful flags overnight. The residents of Jietu Road and Zhuhui district and Yangpu Road and Yulian district also produced a large number of motion scarecrows. Meanwhile, in the city and the outskirts, almost half of the labour force was mobilised into the anti-sparrow army. Usually the young people were responsible for trapping, poisoning and attacking the sparrows, while the old people and the children kept sentry watch. The factories in the city committed themselves into the war effort, even as they guaranteed that they would maintain production levels. In the parks, cemeteries and hothouses, where there are fewer people around, 150 free fire zones were set up for shooting the sparrows. The Nanyang Girls Middle School Rifle Team received training in the techniques for shooting birds. Thus, the citizens fought a total war against the sparrows. By 8 p.m. tonight, it is estimated that a total of 194,432 sparrows have been killed. This vigorous prosecution of the war and their seizure of the initiative ensured a swift victory over the enemy. Within the span of 2 years, over 1.5 billion rats and mice were killed, while they measured the amount of insects killed by tonnage, which, between flies and mosquitoes, evened out to around 113,000 tons of dead bugs. China truly was the pioneer of managed democracy. And the total number of sparrows killed? Over 1 billion. 1 billion birds, with a B, snuffed out of existence. The Communist Party of China loudly proclaimed dominion over the winged reactionaries, only to realize that the enemy was not defeated. Oh no. They had simply changed tactics. Despite their horrendous casualties, the sparrows had migrated to areas far away from human habitation, searching for alternative sources of food with relative success. The Chinese had artificially generated a migration via their front-wide offensive, and in keeping with the teachings of their ancestral homeland, the birds had responded with a lesson drawn from Sun Tzu himself: fight where the enemy isn't. By carrying out this fighting withdrawal, sacrificing their rear guard in the retreat, the sparrows had dealt the unwitting Chinese communists a literal death blow. Cast your minds back, dear viewers, to the beginning of this video, when Australia established its livestock industry. Sparrows, despite their love for seedlings and flowering fruits, are actually omnivorous, specifically insectivores. And what happens when you remove an animal's natural predator? Locusts. Millions upon billions of locusts. A swarm of locusts not seen since my boy Moses dialed 911 to the Big G himself. And it really was like something straight out of Exodus. After the damage inflicted to the Chinese farming industry by Lysenko and collectivization, killing the sparrows resulted in the coup de grace. The following insect plague destroyed what remained of China's food supply, ravaging fields and granaries alike. Where Australia only lost its dignity during our war with the emus, China lost somewhere between 20 to 50 million people from the resulting famine, and to this day, we still don't know exactly how many people died. Yet of course, just like Stalin exporting wheat during the Holodomor, Mao refused to change policies or stop the production of cash crops in order to maintain the industrialization drive. It was only until a near revolt by the Politburo against him that Mao stepped down. With the change in leadership, The new chairman of the party, Liu Shaoxi, took the first step towards building the China we know today, by instituting a version of the new economic policy implemented by Lenin during the 1920s. The farms were evenly divided up among the peasants for them to own and profit from themselves. Small businesses were permitted, market reforms took place, while mass investment into infrastructure to support a modern economy was begun, including consumer goods production and incentives for better workplace performance. And as part of these reforms, a famous Chinese ornithologist, Cao Xin-sheng, was brought on board to resolve the ecological damage from the anti-sparrow campaign. Slowly but surely, Chinese society began to recover from this disaster and take its first steps forward into modernity. And then Mao came out of retirement, claiming the party had lost its way without him, and denounced these reforms as pure bourgeois reaction. He declared the Politburo to be traitors and called for a new revolution. One might say, a cultural revolution. Both Liu and Zhou were imprisoned as counter-revolutionaries. Their reforms were reversed, ancient Chinese culture and traditions were condemned to the dustbin of history, while entire swathes of the party were denounced as capitalist agents, including the parents of one Xi Jinping, resulting in a return to the pre-reform misery while destroying centuries of Chinese history in the process. And all because they lost a war to birds. So let that be a lesson to you, my friends. If you don't heed the warnings of this tale and confront the avian enemy without proper preparation, you will surely face your destruction. But of course there is another lesson to be learned here. Let the blokes who know what they're doing handle things, for God's sake. We did eventually, and it worked wonders. That's why the score is Australia 1, China 0. And on that bombshell, back to Soviet aviation history I go. Thank you to the sponsor Saley, and thank you to my friends and patrons for their assistance in making this video. I've been Animarchy, this has been the Emu War. I'll see you next time. Oh, for God's sake, not again! Not again!
The democratic penguin's republic shall never die. Ooh, march, march, sons of the ice, for our holy island they shall pay the price. They taxed our fish, then asked for more. We answer tariffs with total